Hi, and welcome to Storytime with Jocelyn. If you can guess, if you watched last week's video, what we're going to be reading this month, yes, we are going to be reading the book A Bear Called Paddington by Michael Bond, which was illustrated by Peggy Fortnum. Now, there's 8 chapters in the book, so we're going to be reading 2 chapters every week this month. And this is Jocelyn's Paddington bear. It is an original Paddington. Well, not too original, but one of the older versions. It's vintage. I got it for her a long time ago. And it still has his coat, his rain boots, his hat, and of course his tag, which says he came from the Darkest Peru to London, England via the Paddington station. And of course on the back, it says, "Please look after this bear. Thanks." Thank you. So yes, Jocelyn has an original, or one of the original Paddington bears. So let us get started reading A Bear Called Paddington. Now, of course, I'm going to give you a little introduction before we get started. Of course, Paddington Bear is a fictional character in children's literature. We're going to be reading the book. He first appeared October 13th, 1958 in A Bear Called Paddington, which was written by Michael Bond and, of course, illustrated by Peggy Fortnum. Now, of course, I got this from the Wikipedia page. The friendly spectacle bear from Darkest Peru with his old hat, his battered suitcase, his duffel coat, and love of marmalade has become a classic character in children's literature. Michael Bond based Paddington Bear on a lone teddy bear that he noticed on a shelf in a London shop near Paddington Station on Christmas Eve 1956, which he bought as a present for his wife. He was inspired by the sight during World War II of Jewish refugee children from Europe arriving in Britain and of London children being evacuated to the countryside. The evacuees bearing labels perhaps similar to that attached to the bear Paddington. "Please look after this bear," or "Please look after this child." The bear inspired Bond to write a story, and in 10 days he had written the first book. The book was given to his agent, Harvey Una, A Bear Called Paddington, and was first published on October 13th, 1958. So let us begin by reading A Bear Called Paddington. Chapter 1. Please look after this bear. Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear, for Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were there to meet their daughter Judy, who was coming home from school for the holidays. It was a warm summer day and the station was crowded with people on their way to the seaside. Trains were whistling, taxis were hooting, porters were rushing about, shouting at one another, and altogether there was so much noise that Mr. Brown, who saw him first, had to tell his wife several times before she understood. "A bear? On Paddington Station?" Mrs. Brown looked at her husband in amazement. "Don't be silly, Henry. There can't be." Mr. Brown adjusted his glasses, Jocelyn, "But there is," he insisted. "I distinctly saw it. Over there, behind those mailbags." It was wearing a funny kind of hat. Without waiting for a reply, he caught hold of his wife's arm, pushed her through the crowd, round a trolley laden with chocolate and cups of tea, past a bookstall, and through a gap in a pile of suitcases towards the lost property office. "There you are," he announced triumphantly, pointing towards a dark corner. "I told you so." Mrs. Brown followed the direction of his arm and dimly made out a small furry object in the shadows. It seemed to be sitting on some kind of suitcase, and around its neck there was a label with some writing on it. The suitcase was old and battered, and on the side in large letters were the words, "Wanted on voyage." Mrs. Brown clutched at her husband. Why, Henry, she explained, I believe you were right after all. It is a bear. She peered at it more closely. It seemed a very unusual kind of bear. It was brown in color, a rather dirty brown, and it was wearing a most odd-looking hat with a wide brim, just as Mr. Brown had said. From beneath the brim, two large round eyes stared back at her. Seeing that something was expected of it, the bear stood up and politely raised its hat, revealing two black ears. Good afternoon, it said in a small, clear voice. Good afternoon, replied Mr. Brown doubtfully. There was a moment of silence. The bear looked at them inquiringly. Can I help you? Mr. Brown looked rather embarrassed. Well, no. As a matter of fact, we were wondering if we could help you. Mrs. Brown bent down. You're a very small bear, she said. The bear puffed out its chest. I'm a very rare sort of bear, he replied importantly. There aren't many of us left where I come from. And where is that? Asked Mrs. Brown. The bear looked around carefully before replying. Darkest Peru. I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway. A stowaway? Mr. Brown lowered his voice and looked anxiously over his shoulder. He almost expected to see a policeman standing behind him with a notebook and pencil taking everything down. Yes, said the bear. I immigrated, you know. A sad expression came into its eyes. I used to live with my Aunt Lucy in Peru, but she had to go into a home for retired bears. You don't mean to say you've come all the way from South America by yourself? Explained Mrs. Brown. The bear nodded. Aunt Lucy always said she wanted me to immigrate where I was old enough. That's why she taught me to speak English. But whatever did you do for food? Asked Mr. Brown. You must be starving. Bending down, the bear unlocked the suitcase with a small key, which it also had round its neck, and brought out an almost empty glass jar. I ate marmalade, he said rather proudly. Bears like marmalade. And I lived in a lifeboat. But what are you going to do now? Said Mr. Brown. You can't just sit on Paddington Station waiting for something to happen. Oh, I shall be all right, I expect. The bear bent down to do up its case again. And he did so. Mrs. Brown caught a glimpse of the writing on the label. It said simply, Please look after this bear. Thank you. She turned appealingly to her husband. Oh, Henry, what shall we do? We can't just leave him here. There's no knowing what might happen to him. London's such a big place where no one or nowhere to go. Can't he come and stay with us for a few days? Mr. Brown hesitated. But Mary, dear, we can't take him, not just like that, after all. After all what? Mrs. Brown's voice had a firm note to it. She looked down at the bear. He is rather sweet, and he'd be such company for Jonathan and Judy. Even if it's only for a little while, they'll never forgive you if they knew you'd left him here. It all seems highly irregular, said Mr. Brown doubtfully. I'm sure there's a law about it. He bent down. Would you like to come and stay with us? He asked. That is, he added hastily, not wishing to offend the bear, if you're not got nothing else planned. The bear jumped and his hat nearly fell off with excitement. Oh, yes, please, I sure would like that very much. I've nowhere to go, and everyone seems in such a hurry. Well, that's settled then, said Mrs. Brown before her husband could change his mind. And you can have marmalade for breakfast every morning. And she tried hard to think of something else that bears might like. Every morning? The bear looked as if he could hardly believe its ears. I only had it on special occasions at home. Marmalade's very expensive in Darkest Peru. Then you shall have it every morning, starting tomorrow, continued Mrs. Brown, and honey on Sunday. A worried expression came over the bear's face. "Will it cost very much?" he asked. "You see, I haven't very much money." "Of course not. We wouldn't dream of charging you anything." "You shall expect to be one of the family, shan't he, Henry?" Mrs. Brown looked at her husband for support. "What do you think, Jocelyn?" "Of course," said Mr. Brown. "By the way," he added, "if you're coming home with us, you better know our names. This is Mrs. Brown, and I'm Mr. Brown." The bear raised his hat politely. "Twice. I haven't really got a name," he said. "Only a Peruvian one which no one can understand." "Then we'd better give you an English one," said Mrs. Brown. "I'd make things much easier." She looked around the station for inspiration. "It ought to be something special," she said thoughtfully. As she spoke, an engine standing in one of the platforms and gave a loud whistle and let off a cloud of steam. "I know what," she explained. "We found you on Paddington Station, so we'll call you Paddington! Paddington!" The bear repeated it several times to make sure. "It seems a very long name." "Quite distinguished," said Mr. Brown. "Yes, I like Paddington as a name. Paddington it shall be." Mrs. Brown stood up. "Good. Now, Paddington, I have to meet our little daughter Judy off the train. She's coming home from school. I'm sure you must be thirsty after your long journey. So you go along to the buffet with Mr. Brown and he'll buy you a nice cup of tea." Paddington licked his lips. "I'm very thirsty," he said. "Seawater makes you thirsty." He picked up his suitcase, pulled his hat down firmly over his head, and waved a paw politely in the direction of the buffet. "After you, Mr. Brown." Thank you, Paddington," said Mr. Brown. "Now, Henry, look after him," Mrs. Brown called after them. "And for goodness sake, when you get a moment, take that label off his neck. It makes him look like a parcel. I'm sure he'll get put in a luggage van or something if a porter sees him." The buffet was crowded when they entered, but Mr. Brown managed to find a table for two in the corner. By standing on a chair, Paddington could just rest his paws comfortably on the glass top. He looked around with interest while Mr. Brown went to fetch the tea. The sight of everyone eating reminded him of how hungry he felt. There was a half-eaten bun on the table, but just as he reached out his paw, a waitress came up and swept it into a pan. "You don't want that, dearie," she said, giving him a friendly pat. "You don't know where it's been." Paddington felt so empty he didn't really mind where it had been, but he was much too polite to say anything. "Well, Paddington," said Mr. Brown as he placed two steaming cups of tea on the table and a plate piled high with cakes. "How's that going on with?" Oh, Paddington's eyes glistened. "It's very nice, thank you," he explained, eyeing the tea doubtfully, "but it's rather hard drinking out of a cup. I usually get my head stuck, or else my hat falls in and makes it taste nasty." Mr. Brown hesitated. "Then you better give your hat to me. I'll pour the tea into a saucer for you. It's not really done in the best circles, but I'm sure no one will mind just this once." Paddington removed his hat and laid it carefully on the table while Mr. Brown poured out the tea. He looked hungrily at the cakes, in particular at the large cream and jam one, which Mr. Brown placed on a plate in front of him. Jocelyn. "There you are, Paddington," he said. "I'm sorry they haven't any marmalade ones, but they were the best I could get." "I'm glad I emigrated," said Paddington as he reached out a paw and pulled the plate nearer. "Do you think anyone could mind if I stood on the table to eat?" Before Mr. Brown could answer, he had climbed up and placed his right paw firmly on the bun. It was a very large bun, the biggest and stickiest Mr. Brown had been able to find, and in the matter of moments, most of the inside found its way onto Paddington's whiskers. People started to nudge each other and began staring in their direction. Mr. Brown wished he had chosen a plain, ordinary bun, but he wasn't very experienced in the ways of bears. He stirred his tea and looked out the window, pretending he had tea with a bear on Paddington Station every day of his life. "Henry!" The sound of his wife's voice brought him back to earth with a start. "Henry! Whatever are you doing to that poor bear? Look at him. He's covered all over with cream and jam." Mr. Brown jumped up in confusion. "He seemed rather hungry," he answered lamely. Mrs. Brown turned to her daughter. "This is what happens when I leave your father alone for 5 minutes. Judy clapped her hands excitedly. "Oh, Daddy! Is he really going to stay with us?" "If he does," said Mrs. Brown, "I can see someone other than your father will have to look after him. Just look at the mess he's in." Paddington, who all this time had been too interested in his bun to worry about what was going on, suddenly became aware that people were talking about him. He looked up to see that Mrs. Brown had been joined by a little girl with laughing blue eyes and long fair hair. He jumped up, meaning to raise his hat, and in his haste slipped on a patch of strawberry jam which somehow or another had found its way on the glass tabletop. For a brief moment he had a dizzy impression of everything and everyone being upside down. He waved his paws widely in the air, and then, before anyone could catch him, he somersaulted backwards and landed with a splash in his saucer of tea. He jumped up even quicker than he had sat down because the tea was still very hot, and promptly stepped into Mr. Brown's cup. Judy threw back her head and laughed until the tears rolled down her face. "Oh, Mommy, isn't he funny?" she cried. Paddington, who didn't think it at all was funny, stood for a moment with one foot on the table and the other Mr. Brown's tea. There were large patches of white cream all over his face, and on his left ear there was a lump of strawberry jam, Jocelyn. "You wouldn't think," said Mrs. Brown, "that anyone could get in such a state with just one bun." Mr. Brown coughed. He had just caught the stern eye of a waitress on the other side of the counter. "Perhaps," he said, "we better go. I'll see if I can find a taxi." He picked up Judy's belongings and hurried outside. Paddington stepped gingerly off the table and, with a last look at the sticky remains of his bun, climbed down on the floor. Judy took one of his paws. "Come along, Paddington. We'll take you home, and you can have a nice hot bath. Then you can tell me all about South America. I'm sure you must have lots of wonderful adventures." "I have," said Paddington earnestly. "Lots. Things are always happening to me. I'm that sort of bear." When they came out of the buffet, Mr. Brown had already found a taxi, and he waved them across. The driver looked hard at Paddington and then at the inside of his nice, clean taxi. "Bears is 6 pence extra," he said gruffly. "Sticky bears is 9 pence. "He can't help being sticky, driver," said Mr. Brown. "He's just had a nasty accident." The driver hesitated. "All right, hop in, but mind none of it comes off on me interior. I only cleaned it out this morning." The Browns trooped obediently into the back of the taxi. Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Judy sat in the back, while Paddington stood on a tip-up seat behind the driver so that he could see out of the window. The sun was shining as they drove out of the station, and after the gloom and the noise, everything seemed bright and cheerful, Jocelyn. They swept past a group of people at a bus stop, and Paddington waved. Several people stared, and one man raised his hat in return. It was all very friendly. After weeks of sitting alone in a lifeboat, there was so much to see. There were people in cars and big red buses everywhere. It wasn't a bit like Darkest Peru. Paddington kept one eye out the window in case he missed anything. With his other eye, he carefully examined Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Judy. Mr. Brown was fat and jolly with a big mustache and glasses, while Mrs. Brown, who was also rather plump, looked like a larger edition of Judy. Paddington was just decided that he was going to like staying with the Browns when the glass window behind the driver shot back and a gruff voice said, "Where did you say you wanted to go?" Mr. Brown leaned forward. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens." The driver cupped his ear with one hand. "Can't hear you," he shouted. Paddington tapped him on the shoulder. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens," he repeated. The taxi driver jumped at the sound of Paddington's voice and narrowly missed hitting a bus. He looked down at his shoulder and glared. "Cream!" he said bitterly. "All over me new coat!" Judy giggled, and Mr. and Mrs. Brown exchanged glances. Mr. Brown peered at the meter. He half expected to see a sign go up saying they had to pay another 6 pence. "I beg your pardon," said Paddington. He bent forward and tried to rub the stain off with his other paw. Several bum crumbs and a smear of jam added themselves mysteriously to the taxi driver's coat. The driver gave Paddington a long, hard look. Paddington raised his hat and the driver slammed the window shut again. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. "We really shall have to give him a bath as soon as we get indoors. It's getting everywhere." Paddington looked thoughtful. He wasn't so much that he didn't like baths. He really didn't mind being covered with jam and cream. He seemed to pity to wash it all off quite so soon, but before he had time to consider the matter, the taxi stopped and the Browns began to climb out. Paddington picked up his suitcase and followed Judy up a flight of white steps to a big green door. "Now, you're going to meet Mrs. Bird," said Judy. "She looks after us. She's a bit fierce sometimes, and she grumbles a lot, but she doesn't really mean it. I'm sure you'd like her." Paddington felt his knees begin to tremble. He looked round for Mr. and Mrs. Brown, but they appeared to having some sort of argument with the taxi driver. Behind the door, he could hear footsteps approaching. "I'm sure I shall like her, if you say so," he said, catching sight of his reflection on the brightly polished letterbox. "But will she like me?" All right, we're off to read chapter 2. A bear and hot water. Looks kind of guilty. Paddington wasn't quite sure what to expect when Mrs. Bird opened the door. He was pleasantly surprised when they were greeted by a stout, motherly lady with gray hair and a kindly twinkle in her eyes. When she saw Judy, she raised her hands above her head. "Goodness gracious, you've arrived already?" she said in horror. "And me hardly finished the washing up. I suppose you'll be wanting tea." "Hello, Mrs. Bird," said Judy. "It's nice to see you again. How's the rheumatism?" "Worse than it's ever been," began Mrs. Bird. Then she stopped speaking and stared at Paddington. "Whatever have you got there?" he asked. "What is it?" "It's not a what," said Judy. "It's a bear. His name's Paddington." Paddington raised his hat. "A bear?" said Mrs. Bird doubtfully. "Well, he has good manners, I'll say that for him. Right, Jocelyn?" "He's going to stay with us," announced Judy. "He's immigrated from South America, and he's all alone with nowhere to go." "Going to stay with us?" Mrs. Bird raised her arms again. "How long for?" Judy looked around mysteriously before replying. "I don't know," she said. "It depends on things." "Mercy me!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "I wish you'd told me. I haven't put clean sheets in the spare room or anything. She looked out at Paddington. Though judging by the state, he's in perhaps that as well. It's all right, Mrs. Bird, said Paddington. I think I'm going to have a bath. I had an accident with a bun. Oh, Mrs. Bird held the door open. Oh, well, in that case, you're best come on in. Only mind the carpet. It's just been done. Judy took hold of Paddington's paw and squeezed. She doesn't mind, really, she whispered. I think she rather likes you. Paddington watched the retreating figure of Mrs. Bird. She seems a bit fierce, he said. Mrs. Bird turned. What was that you said? Paddington jumped. He began. Where was it you said you'd come from? Peru? That's right, said Paddington. Darkest Peru. Mrs. Bird looked thoughtful for a moment. Then I expect you like marmalade. I better get some more from the grocer. There you are! What did I tell you? Cried Judy as the door shut behind Mrs. Bird. She does like you. Fancy her knowing I like marmalade, said Paddington. Mrs. Bird knows everything about everything, said Judy. Now you better get upstairs with me and I'll show you your room. It used to be mine when I was small, and it has lots of pictures of bears round the wall, so I expect you'd feel at home. She led the way up a long flight of stairs, chattering all the time. Paddington followed closely behind, keeping carefully to the side so that he didn't have to tread on the carpet. That's the bathroom, said Judy, and that's my room, and that's Jonathan's. He's my brother, and you'll meet him soon. And that's Mommy and Daddy's. She opened the door, and this is going to be yours. Paddington nearly fell over with surprise when he followed her into the room. He'd never seen such a big one. There was a large bed with white sheets against one wall and several big boxes, one with a mirror on it. Judy pulled open a drawer in one of the boxes. This is called a chest of drawers, she said. You'll be able to keep all your things in here. Paddington looked at the drawer and then at his suitcase. I don't seem to have very much. That's the trouble with being small. No one ever expects you to want things. Then we shall have to see what we can do, said Judy mysteriously. I'll try and get Mummy to take you on one of her shopping expeditions. She knelt down beside him. Let me help you unpack. It's very kind of you, Paddington fumbled with the lock, but I don't think there's much to help with. There's a jar of marmalade, only there's hardly any left now. And what there is tastes like seaweed, and my scrapbook, and some centavos. They're sort of a South American penny. Gosh, said Judy, I've never seen any of those before. Aren't they bright? Oh, I keep them polished, said Paddington. I don't spend them. He pulled out a tattered photograph, and that's a picture of my Aunt Lucy. She had taken it just before we went into the home for retired bears in Lima. She looks very nice, said Judy, and very wise. Seeing that Paddington had a sad, faraway look in his eyes, she added hastily, well, I'm going to leave you now so that you can have your bath and come down nice and clean. You'll find 2 taps, one marked hot and one marked cold. There's plenty of soap and a clean towel. Oh, and a brush so that you can scrub your back. It sounds very complicated, said Paddington. Can't I just sit in a puddle or something? Judy laughed. Somehow I don't think Mrs. Bird would approve of that. And don't forget to wash your ears. They look awfully black. They're meant to be black, Paddington called indulgently as Judy shut the door. He climbed up on the stool by the window and looked out. There was a large, interesting garden below with a small pond and several trees, which looked good for climbing, Jocelyn. And beyond the trees, he could see more and more houses stretching away into the distance. He decided he must be wonderful living in a house like this all the time. He stayed where he was, thinking about it, until the window became steamed up and he couldn't see out anymore. Then he tried writing his name on the cloudy part with his paws. He began to wish it wasn't quite so long. As he soon ran out of cloud, it was rather difficult to spell. All the same, he climbed onto the dresser table and looked at himself in the mirror. It's a very important name. I don't expect there are many bears in the world called Paddington. If he'd only known. Judy was saying exactly the same thing to Mr. Brown at that very moment. The Browns were holding a council of war in the dining room, and Mr. Brown was fighting a losing battle. It had been Judy's idea in the first place to keep Paddington. In this, she not only had Jonathan on her side, but also her mother. Jonathan had yet to meet Paddington, but the idea of having a bear in the family appealed to him. It sounded very important. After all, Henry, argued Mrs. Brown, you can't turn him out now. It wouldn't be right. Mr. Brown sighed. He knew where he was beaten. It wasn't that he didn't like the idea of keeping Paddington. Secretly, he was just as keen as anyone. But as head of the Brown household, he felt he ought to consider the matter from every angle. I'm sure we ought to report the matter to someone first, he said. I don't see why, Dad, cried Jonathan. Besides, he might get arrested for being a stowaway if we do that. Mrs. Brown put down her knitting. Jonathan's right, Henry. We can't let that happen. It's not as if he's done anything wrong. I'm sure he didn't harm anyone traveling in a lifeboat like that. Then there's the question of pocket money, said Mr. Brown, weakening. I'm not sure how much pocket money to give a bear. He can have 1 6 a week, the same as the other children, replied Mrs. Brown. Mr. Brown lit his pipe carefully before replying. Well, he said, we'll have to see what Mrs. Bird has to say about it first, of course. There was a triumph chorus from the rest of the family. You'd better ask her then, said Mrs. Brown when the noise had died down. It was your idea. Mr. Brown coughed. He was a little bit afraid of Mrs. Bird, and he wasn't at all sure how she would take it. He was about to suggest that they left it for a while, when the door opened and Mrs. Bird herself came in with the tea things. She paused for a moment and looked around at the sea of expectant faces. I suppose, she said, you want to tell me you've decided to keep that young Paddington. May we, Mrs. Bird? Pleaded Judy. Please, I'm sure he'll be very good. Hump. Mrs. Bird put the tray down on the table. That remains to be seen. Different people have different ideas about being good. All the same, she hesitated at the door. He looks the sort of bear that means well. Then you don't mind, Mrs. Bird? Mr. Brown asked her. Mrs. Bird thought for a moment. No, I don't mind at all. I've always had a sort of soft spot for bears myself. It'll be nice to have one about the house. Well, gasped Mrs. Brown as the door closed, whoever would have thought it? I expect it was because he raised his hat, said Judy. It made a good impression. Mrs. Bird likes polite people. Mrs. Brown picked up her knitting again. I suppose someone ought to write and tell his Aunt Lucy. I'm sure she'd like to know he's safe. She turned to Judy. Perhaps it would be a nice thought if you and Jonathan wrote. By the way, said Mr. Brown, come to think of it, where is Paddington? He's not still up in his room, is he? Judy looked up from the writing desk where she was searching for some notepaper. Oh, he's all right. He's just having a bath. A bath? Mrs. Brown's face took a worried expression. He's rather small to be having a bath by himself. Don't fuss so, Mary, grumbled Mr. Brown, settling himself down in the armchair with the newspaper. He's probably having a time of his life. Mr. Brown was fairly near the truth when he said Paddington was having the time of his life. Unfortunately, it wasn't in quite the way he meant it. Blissfully unaware that his fate was being decided, Paddington was sitting in the middle of the bathroom floor, drawing a map of South America with a tube of Mr. Brown's shaving cream. Paddington liked geography. At least he liked his sort of geography, which meant seeing strange places and new people. Before he left South America on his long journey to England, his Aunt Lucy, who was a very wise old bear, had done her best to teach him all she knew. She had told him all about the places he would see on the way, and she had spent many long hours reading to him about the people he would meet. It had been a long journey, halfway around the world, and so Paddington's map occupied most of the bathroom floor, Jocelyn, and also used up most of Mr. Brown's shaving cream. With the little that was left, he tried writing his new name again. He had several attempts and finally decided on Paddington. It looked most important. It wasn't until a trickle of warm water landed on his nose that he realized the bath was full and was beginning to run over the side. With a sign, he climbed up on the side of the tub, closed his eyes, held his nose with one paw, and jumped. The water was so hot and soapy and much deeper than he expected. In fact, he had to stand on tiptoe even to keep his nose above the surface. It was then that he had a nasty shock. It's one thing getting into a bath. It's quite another matter getting out, especially when the water comes up to your nose and the sides are slippery and your eyes are full of soap. He couldn't even see the taps off. He tried calling out, "Help!" First in quite a loud voice. Then he said very quiet, "Help!" And then very loudly, "Help! Help!" He waited for a few moments, but no one came. Suddenly he had an idea. What a good thing he was still wearing his hat. He took it off and began bawling it out of the water, taking it out. There were several holes in the hat because it was a very old hat that had once belonged to his uncle. But if the water didn't get much less, at least it didn't get any more. "That's funny," said Mr. Brown, jumping up from his armchair and rubbing his forehead. "I could have sworn I felt a spot of water." "Don't be silly, dear. How could you?" Mrs. Brown, busy with her knitting, didn't even bother to look up. Mr. Brown grunted and returned to his newspaper. He knew he had felt something, but there was no point in arguing. He looked suspiciously at the children, but both Judy and Jonathan were busy writing their letter. "How much does it cost to send a letter to Lima?" asked Jonathan. Judy was about to reply when another drop of water fell down from the ceiling, this time right onto the table. "Oh, gosh!" She jumped to her feet, pulling Jonathan after her. There was an enormous wet patch right over their heads and right beneath the bathroom. "Where are you going now, dear?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Oh, just upstairs to see how Paddington's getting on." Judy pushed Jonathan through the door and shut it quickly behind them. "Crikey!" said Jonathan. "What's up?" "It's Paddington!" cried Judy over her shoulder as she pushed up the stair. "I think he's in trouble." She ran along the landing and banged loudly on the bathroom door. "Are you all right, Paddington?" she shouted. "May we come in?" "Help! Help!" shouted Paddington. "Please come in. I think I'm going to drown." "Oh, Paddington!" Judy leant over the side of the bath and helped Jonathan lift a dripping and very frightened Paddington onto the floor. "Oh, Paddington, thank goodness you're all right." Paddington laid on his back in a pool of water. What a good job I had my hat, he panted. Aunt Lucy told me never to be without it. But why on earth didn't you pull the plug out, you silly? Said Judy. Oh, Paddington looked crestfallen. I never thought of that. Jonathan looked admiringly at Paddington. Creaky, he said. Fancy you making all this mess. Even I've never made such a mess. Paddington sat up and looked around. The whole bathroom floor was covered in a sort of white foam where the hot water had landed on his map of South America. It is a bit untidy, he admitted. I don't really know how it got all like this. Untidy? Judy lifted him to his feet and wrapped a towel around him. Paddington, we've all got a lot of work to do before we go downstairs again. If Mrs. Bird sees this, I don't know what she'll say. I do, explained Jonathan. She says it to me sometimes. Judy began wiping the floor with the cloth. Now, just you dry yourself quickly in case you catch cold. Paddington began rubbing himself meekly with the towel. I must say, he remarked, looking at himself in the mirror, I am a lot cleaner than I was. It doesn't look like me at all. Paddington did look much cleaner than he had when he first arrived at the Browns. His fur, which was really quite light in color and not dark brown as it had been, was standing out like a new brush, except that it was soft and silky. His nose gleamed and his ears had lost all traces of the jam and cream. He was so much cleaner then. When he arrived downstairs and entered the dining room sometime later, everyone pretended not to recognize him. The tradesman's entrance is at the side, said Mr. Brown from behind his paper. Mrs. Brown put down her knitting and stared at him. I think you must have come to the wrong house, she said. This is number 32, not 34. Even Jonathan and Judy agreed there must be some mistake. Paddington began to get quite worried until they all burst out laughing and said how nice he looked now that he was brushed and combed and respectable. They made room for him in a small armchair by the fire, and Mrs. Bird came in with another pot of tea and a plate of hot buttered toast. Now, Paddington, said Mr. Brown, when they were all settled, suppose you tell us all about yourself and how you came to Britain. Paddington settled back in his armchair, wiped a smear of butter carefully from his whiskers, put his paws behind his head, and stretched out his toes towards the fire. He liked his audience, especially when he was warm and the world seemed such a nice place. Right, Jocelyn? I was brought up in Darkest Peru, he began, by my Aunt Lucy. She's the one that lives in a home for retired bears. In Lima. He closed his eyes thoughtfully. A hush fell over the room and everyone waited expectantly. After a while, when nothing happened, they began to get restless. Mr. Brown coughed loudly. It doesn't seem a very exciting story, he said impatiently. He reached across and poked Paddington with his pipe. Well, I never, he said. I do believe he's fallen asleep. And that is chapter 2. Next week, we're going to be starting with chapter 3 and chapter 4. So I hope you will be joining us for that. And I hope you enjoyed our first video and part 1 of A Bear Called Paddington. And Paddington would like to give everyone a hug out there and a kiss. Have a blessed weekend, and we will see you next Friday for part 2 of A Bear Called Paddington. Bye-bye.